Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Dyslexia Success Stories. And I like that success part because too many people think dyslexia is a lifelong struggle. And there's a lot of challenge to that. And I'm bringing you that perspective as a brain scientist, peer review published in neuropsychology, neuroimaging, neurorehabilitation, and neurodevelopmental disorders. So I have a bit of expertise in the brain. And that said, I'm also dyslexic, but I got prevention at age 5, and I've not had lifelong struggle. And today I'm happy to bring you a new guest. And this guest is David Agata. And David's had a background in the military career and then got very interested in dyslexia when he found out in his 50s, but that's why he struggled academically. David, welcome to the show today. Great to have you here.
I don't want to correct you, but it was law enforcement, not military.
Okay, sorry.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Doc. I really appreciate it. It's always good to catch up with you. Excellent. Where do you want me to start? Do you want me to start with education?
Well, I think give us a little bit of background. What did you remember about school? Because I think it's unique to be that you were not really aware that you had dyslexia until you're in your 50s. Nobody brought it up. Was it just non-existent for you? What was really happening?
So I'm 61. I went to school I grew up in New York City, and they had pretty good schools. However, the standard play from elementary school to high school was, David, you're very smart, but you're lazy.
Wow.
So that was the standard mantra.
Yeah.
There were topics that I enjoyed. There were topics I didn't. I didn't really enjoy reading, so I didn't know any different. My mom was handicapped. She had had a stroke when I was very young. So I grew up around the Rusk Institute, NYU, going to rehabilitation with my mom. So I saw a lot of kids in a lot of different states, but I just figured, I just don't like reading, but I like other stuff. I'm interested. I struggled in high school, emotionally struggled, family issues, and by just bearing down and my dad helping me drive through, I was able to graduate high school just by the skin of my teeth. Now, he did get me involved in some activities like the drama club and sing and some other stuff that I could focus on. And I said, well, I guess I could do good at that. And in my senior year, I started working out with a crew of folks in martial arts where I went, oh, okay, I'm not stupid. I'm not lazy. I know I can do things and move ahead. 17, I moved to California and from New York. A year or two later, I met my wife. My wife, Sharon, and I have been together for almost 43 years, married 40 years.
Nice.
So yeah, that's a novelty. And in an attempt to try and figure out where I wanted to work and how, what could I do for a career? I had tried a number of different things. I was encouraged by multiple people to go to school. If you get an education, you're going to move ahead. And I had no desire to go to school, none. Like the last thing I wanted to do was go to school. And after I had been married maybe 2 or 3 years, I said, I think I have an opportunity to be involved in law enforcement. I think that's something I could really do well at. My dad had worked for the NYPD for 25 years as a civilian photographer. And I grew up with all cops and firemen, and I didn't want to take the red pill. I wanted to take the blue pill. In the 80s, it was very difficult when we were in California to get hired as affirmative action said male Caucasians was the smallest amount. I didn't have any education. I didn't have any military. And, in high school, I think I smoked weed twice. And at the time, it's like, ooh. Now it's like, did you smoke today? Do you have a card? But it was very, very difficult. And everybody wanted to be in law enforcement.
Wow.
The first couple of tests that I took were very, very difficult, and I failed them flat out. So I went to one of these test-taking courses and learned how to take a test. I think it was actually for the course that I took was for LSATs, the test that you would take to become an attorney or to get into law school. And really what they would do is they would teach you how to read questions and how to, and the reading comprehension was always very difficult, but it was like, I had to just read it really slow and then look at the answers and go. So I knew I didn't have any intellectual issues. I just didn't like to read. It was difficult. It was very difficult. I went to work in law enforcement in South Florida in 1989. And the one thing about law enforcement is everything is sequential, meaning, if this, then here's the next step, and here's the next step, and here's your choices that are in front of you. Tactics, the same thing. You're multitasking and you're saying, okay, is a crime being committed? Are the elements being met? Am I being safe? What's going? I could do that. I had horrible handwriting. I had to write with this writing template because at the time you actually had to use pen and paper to write reports.
Right.
And you had little lines, so everything was in capital letters. My spelling was horrible. My writing was horrible. Now, and I'll come back to that because that becomes one of the flags after my remediation.
Okay.
So I do a full career in the city of Coral Springs, which, all good and bad things start and finish there. You'll know Coral Springs because those were the officers that ran into Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Parkland was a city right above Coral Springs.
Okay.
And my personal involvement was I was part of the SWAT team and had become a sniper team leader. And actually, when you're a sniper, you have to learn math. And I was like, oh, now I understand why you need math.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand why you needed to read and have numbers, but now I understood it. Excelled at the career because it was all sequential. Reading, I had to learn to read. This is called a statute book with all the different statutes. And the way that you would investigate a crime is, did it meet this? Did it meet this? Did it meet this? It's sequential. So it's logic via math. So I did well with that because you just have to be able to say, yep, that fits. Right. And then all of my report writing was from first person. Not difficult. I did this, I did this, I did this. The hardest part was editing. And when we first started writing reports, we had to use something called whiteout. And I had it was about this big. It was a dictionary. And I had to sit there with my dictionary to learn to make sure I was, and it also dictated how I would actually do my reports. Why? Because if it's a hard word, you don't use it. You use simple words.
Yeah, skip around.
Yeah. So I got really good at that. And you do it repetition, you get good at it. And I knew what I needed to write and I knew how I needed to do it. And I knew what I needed to look for. I was very good at tactics. So I knew I wasn't stupid anymore. And I knew I wasn't lazy. I finished my career there. I went out into the corporate world for a little bit and then went back into training. I was a contractor for the United States Coast Guard. I taught counter and anti-terrorism. I had taught sniping, police sniping. I was a firearms instructor, a tactical instructor. These were things that I liked, so I would do good at them. Research was very difficult. You have to know your history. If you're going to move ahead, you don't want to make the same mistake. So reading was very difficult. For example, when I was working private security, I remember reading The Hunt for Red October, and it took me months to read it. Like I had to put it down and come back, put it down and come back. But I really liked it. But again, months.
And tell me why. Why do you think it took months to do it? It
was just so difficult that, I'd get 3 or 4 pages and just, what did I just read? I got to go back. So comprehension.
So the struggle of reading had an impact on comprehension of reading.
Yeah. And it wasn't a lack of desire because you had to do the research. You had to learn, what happened with the SAS, what happened with LAPD and LA County SWAT, and why is that important? And what's the case law and the history for Tennessee versus Garner, Terry stops, understanding your craft, you have to do your research. It's very difficult. It took hours. Utilizing highlighters, thank God those came in. Reading, rereading, reading out loud. That was one of the workarounds for me, which was I had to read my reports out loud and go, yeah, that's wrong. Because if I heard it, it would make more sense. In fact, today I am an adjunct professor for Kaiser University, and I tell my students, proofread out loud. So P.S., got through all of that, and the contract industry fell out. And
Right.
being away from home, and I'd been overseas. I had trained law enforcement professionals from like 24 or probably about 18 different countries, 5 or 6 different languages, teaching them tactics, teaching them what we do. It was a Department of State, so I was kind of like a diplomat.
Mm-hmm. And the
Again,
teaching was hands-on verbal, or the teaching was
yes.
textbook written and you're
No,
writing stuff?
it was kinetic training. So, hey guys, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we do it. This is the mindset. Let's go do it.
Right.
So
Verbal
again,
description with actually physical practice. By kinetic, you
yes.
mean the body is doing it. You're going through the steps you have to do.
Let's go to the shoot house. Let's go to the range. Let's do these
Mhm.
tactics. And when I would like do their manual, fortunately, I knew the material. But again, I would spend hours in the hotel, reading out loud. And again, repetition. Very difficult, but I'm a communicator, so I could do that. I could overcompensate for that.
Right.
Um,
And what did that do to your energy level and how much time it took you to get these things done?
because I had I'm not going to quit attitude,
Yeah.
I would stick at it, which is critical because the next step in my career was I was trying to get a job after in 2012, I was away from home 360 days,
Wow.
325 days. And I said
Okay.
to Sharon, my wife, I said, I don't want to travel anymore. I don't need a gold membership to the hotels or the airlines. I don't want to get on another plane. I want to stay home.
Mm-hmm.
I had come home and I moved up to Central Florida, and a good friend of mine who had 3 master's degrees and was a law enforcement trainer said, I think you should get your bachelor's degree. And I'm like, bro, I don't want nothing to do with that. He talked some sense into me, and I said, okay, I'm going to try it.
Yeah. And why, David? Why was your first inclination of no way?
I did not have the want or desire to fight through what it was going to take to do that.
Gotcha.
And when I looked at the job market, I went, I need a degree. Nobody cares if you have 25 years of law enforcement. They don't care if you've hung out of helicopters and you've taught people in Jordan how to shoot out of helicopters and how to do executive protection. No one cares because there was a dime a dozen.
Right.
Somebody had sand in their shoes from being overseas. They were a subject matter expert.
Yeah.
No disrespect, they may have been, but I didn't have a degree. So I said, all right. So I started working on my bachelor's program, and they were 4-week courses, and I had 33 of them I had to do.
Wow. That sounds like Mount Everest for the dyslexic.
It was. And I had a list with each of my classes, and I'd order my books ahead of time and start going through my books again.
Wow.
Highlight pens, and once the syllabus would come out, I would look at the syllabus and see what is it I need to look for. I didn't want to waste time on the minutia, which that's a workaround. Why can't I just read the textbook? Because it just took too much time, which again, people don't understand. Oh, it's a superpower. Yeah. When did that gift come? Because I want to send it back. Can I get a refund? Can we get a return label back to Amazon or Prime? So I would take hours, because even an undergraduate's program, you get a textbook, and for example, criminal procedure. I teach that. Well, can't really see it, but it's got pictures, it's got highlight. So I would have to, and I still do it, I have to highlight and outline what's important.
Yeah.
And it was extreme. It was all consuming for 3 years. Gotcha. I mean, I could write. You asked me to write a paper. You asked me to write a journal assignment, which is 500 or 600 words. You asked me to interact. No problem. And one of the keys is research, which that'll also come up in a little bit here. Learning to use something called ProQuest, which, when you were going through your PhD, you had to go to the library and go through the little cards to find what it is you wanted, and then check the book out and then go make copies of it and bring it home. Now all you have to do is go online. So except I had to print it out. And the reason I had to print it out was my friend, the highlighter, had to help me find what it is I needed, because looking at it on a computer, it would just be blurry after a while. I didn't have any, I didn't see letters backwards. I didn't, it just.
And when people talk about that, they talk about words moving or words jumping or words flipping. Those features are not part of the diagnostic criteria of how we actually diagnose dyslexia.
Right.
Mostly those are thought to be secondary symptoms of the amount of effort, the amount of struggle, the amount of strain you're experiencing, and you're not even sure how to figure this word out, that you start to get blurry-eyed. So all those things are secondary things that are not causal factors. They didn't create the reading problem, but they certainly represent the amount of stress, effort, and struggle that was in that reading skill.
I kind of say it's like, if you want to mow the lawn and there's a hurricane blowing, it's not a good time. The hurricane's got nothing to do with the lawn cutting.
Right.
And it's kind of when they talk about attention deficit disorder and all these other things. That's a hurricane. That's a storm on its own. It's got nothing to do with me trying to cut the lawn with a push mower.
Right.
It just makes it harder for me to push the mower.
Yeah.
Get through my bachelor's degree. I go back into law enforcement wearing a gun belt and push forward to 2017. And I realized I needed to get my master's degree, because everybody has a bachelor's degree, because they just check a box and they're there.
And again, it's back to you having aspirations. You
yes.
want to go higher. You want to
moving forward.
Yeah.
How do I find success? Because just strapping a gun belt on isn't going to do it. I mean, you can only do it so much, and for so long. And the industry itself is a very difficult industry to be in right now anyway.
Right.
Different discussion.
Right.
However, the master's program was 12 classes. I believe they were all 8-week courses, except for the capstone, which was 16 or 12.
Okay.
And typically for the criminal justice program, you're going through ethics and all the criminal procedures and, these higher level courses. And typically the way the program's set up is, as you move through it, you're building for your capstone program, which if somebody hasn't been in university, they won't know. But a capstone is what you do as a final project. Either you can take a test or you can build a project. For PhD, they'll do a dissertation. They'll argue their point. For the master's program, you can propose a plan or put a thesis together.
Right.
So one of the places that I was very, I believe I'm pretty talented in, is training human beings. I understand how human beings learn. Imitation, repetition, trial and error. Unfortunately, trial and error means you make mistakes before you do better. Right. There's this and this conversation of muscle memory. There is no such thing as muscle memory, which, by the way, thank you, Doc. And again, I'll get to where that comes in, but there's conscious competency and unconscious competency. And the unconscious competency is like breathe. That's unconscious. So we hope that we can build those skills. And that's one of the areas that law enforcement struggles in today. And that's why we see what we see. And everything is live. Everything's on camera. Everything is there.
Right.
And I said, there's got to be a better way. Maybe I can get my degree to be able to do that. So I was halfway through my program. Fast forward to January 2019, week 2. Sunday afternoon after church, Sharon and I we always dreamed of buying a house on the beach. But we would also like to get lunch, and the best fish tacos are at Burrito Works on 4th Street, South 4th Street in Flagler Beach.
You bet.
And there's 7 or 8 benches on the outside, and there's this little shack, and it's like no fries, just chips, and you get your fountain drink. The story is that's where we met. I think we were on the end table. There was a crazy guy at the first table, so I definitely wasn't going to sit there. And lo and behold, you came over and sat down, and we ate our tacos and burritos. And I said, and I could have a conversation with a hot cup and be able to communicate, because communications isn't the issue.
Right.
We started talking, and you said, well, I'm a neuroscientist. I said, oh, you're a brain surgeon? He said, no, I'm a brain scientist. And that was where this myopic view of the universe began to open up, because you started talking about communications and language and how we learn.
Right. All those
Thank
pieces.
you, Angela. And all of a sudden, the pieces came together. And I think we talked for like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I remember you said, "I'm Tim Conway." I said, "Let me see your ID, dude. No way that's your real name. You're trying to get my ID card. You just like, you skimmed my credit card."
Only people over the age of 30 know. So that was a famous comedian back in the day.
On Carol Burnett.
With the Carol Burnett show, things like that. Yes, you bet.
So remember I told you about ProQuest, and investigations. I could do research,
right?
Because that's like an investigation. What's your name? What's your date of birth? Where do you live? What happened? What happened in what order? Well, I went back and Googled in the ProQuest, Dr. Tim Conway dyslexia, and I had over 40 to 50 citations come up. And I went, okay, this guy's not a swindler. He's not selling, he is who he says he is. And let me see if I can match the picture to the name. And then I found your aunt and uncle, the Loma Lindas. And then I found
Linda Moods.
Moods. I'm sorry. There it is.
There's the yeah.
So, and that was one of the discussions we had. I said, I was having trouble pronouncing certain things.
Right.
And I think one of your comments was, I asked you, what are some of the things that this is from?
Right.
And you began to say, well, some of it is pronunciation, and decoding goes with pronunciation. And I'm like, ooh, remembering people's names is not a problem, but pronouncing them is.
Right.
And we started talking about all these underlying characteristics.
Yeah.
And the next 3 to 4 weeks was kind of traumatic, because I had realized now what was the problem.
For you personally?
Yes.
You knew you struggled. Nobody in your school years ever said, we think you have a learning problem. Actually, they literally said you were lazy, which we've hoped that doesn't happen today, but I'm afraid it probably still does. It's not about effort. It's not about drive, desire, pursuits of achievements. It's, if reading is so hard and nothing that the schools are doing is changing your reading skills, you got to figure out another route. You got to figure out another way to work around it. And it's not going to be beating your head against the reading door when the reading door is not opening for you.
The way they were teaching to read didn't work for me. So I went ahead and stopped. I was going to do my master's thesis on training, and you and I were discussing that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the questions you asked me, you said, "Hey, Dave, do you know what the top 3 killers of juveniles are?"
Yeah. And
I went, well, of course, I ran a gang and drug prevention center. Violent death, drug and alcohol related death, and suicide. And that hasn't changed in 30 years. And then you said, you know what else hasn't changed in 30 years? And you said the reading scores. And I didn't quite comprehend that. Within that 3 to 4 week period, probably that night, I contacted the director of my CJ program at American Military University. And I said, hey, Chuck, I'm changing my thesis. I'm going to totally change gears. He's like, what do you mean? I said, let me write you an executive summary. I said, I'm looking at just brief data that says 70 to 75% of juveniles that are in the system are illiterate. That was one. 2.
High, really high. And let me clarify for the viewers. By CJ, you're talking about your criminal justice training program.
Yes.
So you're doing the master's on criminal justice. You're planning to go this way with your capstone thesis. We start talking about juveniles, and your topic starts to shift.
Like, not even slow. Here's where the myopic opened up wide. If 70 to 75% of juveniles who are in the criminal justice system have a literacy issue.
Yeah.
Maybe not specifically dyslexia, but we know the numbers on that. I'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
And we know that 50 to 80% of the adults are illiterate, which means 60% are dropouts out of high school.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is an
When you say 50 to 80% of adults
There's a
are
reason why
illiterate,
that number swings.
that's the men and women adults that are incarcerated in prison,
Yes.
not the general population. 50 to 80% of men and women in prison are so illiterate they can't even fill out a job application on
Correct.
screen or in print in any way, shape, or form.
And I looked at those numbers and I said, and I was from a place called Coral Springs, and we won the Sterling Award for learning how to do best practices, community policing, process improvement. How do we fix a problem? How do we do that cumulatively as a team? And I looked at this and I went, this is the answer to crime prevention in the United States.
Right.
And there's two places that we can engage this. One is at the elementary level, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the other is the enrichment of those that are already incarcerated. And my basic proposal was to say, let's take first-time offenders and address them with proven reading, because one of the things that I had to do during that next year was I spent hours, thousands of hours probably, doing my research. And I was working in elementary schools because this was after Stoneman Douglas. So I was looking at, I had known and understood what active shooters are and how they come about and why it's so important to be able to address this. And we had changed the law in Florida, so law enforcement had to be in school. But, you know, the irony was, I'm looking at this going, a majority of these, and you and I have had this discussion when we look at some of the handwriting, that they probably have a literacy issue. So we know that somewhere around 20% of the population has a neurobiological disorder known as dyslexia.
And we can call it, when you throw in together mild, moderate, or severe, that whole range, you're going to get about 1 out of 5 people are having some degree of struggle that would be more genetically based in its origins.
And one of the discussions that you and I had was, is it possible that all of these people have a disorder known as dyslexia, that 20% of the population is in prison? No, there's other things. And two things changed my worldview. The National Association of Education Professionals, they track their numbers.
Yeah.
I think it's third grade, 6th grade, and high school.
4th, 8th, and 12th.
They track their numbers, and they're good at it. I mean, they're academics. They track their data.
I'm going to clarify. It's a National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP.
NAEP.
Yeah, and they've got a website. I'll put it on the links here for folks who want to look at it. It's actually called nationsreportcard.gov. And it reports the data that they've collected about every 4 years since about 1971. And the data is looking at literacy or reading rates. They look at other data, but for this podcast today, let's just talk about the reading. They look at the reading rates about every 4 years, a random sample across every state in the United States. And in 1971, 35% of students across the country are proficient readers, which means grade level for accuracy, grade level for speed, and grade level for comprehension. And in 2024, we've got data points from 71 all the way to 2024. And David, what kind of line is it?
Flat.
It's a flat line. It's still about 35%. So the way we're allowing the educational system to run today is not giving teachers the tools that actually increases the success of literacy. There's small gains being made in some states, and people are making big deals out of, we've gone up 5%, we've gone up 10%. You're still below 50%. You're not making major change if we let the system keep making things up. And that's going to lead to that population.
Yes. And that, to me, was like, that's, you know, they talk about these sources of crime. Yes, they could be economic and socio and cultural and all that. But the bottom line is we're not equipping children to read. So we know from pre-K to 3rd grade is when we teach kids how to read.
Yeah.
And those 3 components, here I am telling the guy that taught me this, is decoding, fluency, and comprehension. And it's either one or all of those or parts of those where they struggle with their literacy. And when I did my research, and I was working in elementary school, so I knew what curriculums they were using. I knew about, I did the research on how they did their tier system. And in short, it can take a year or two till they finally say, yeah, now we're going to do something, because, you know, there's the time frames and, oh, it's the end of the year, so let's move on. And they go into basically what's called an individual education program, which is where a group of people get together and go, rock, scissors, paper. Oh, we'll do these. Now, by law, they have to do that. It's called an accommodation. But it's like, okay, so now instead of doing it in the classroom, you're going to take me to a small table or out in the hallway. I couldn't figure it out in there. I'm not going to figure it out in the hallway.
Right.
I mean, I might get a little better where you can say, yeah, but the idea that you're going to read me the questions and then ask me to answer them. And I'm beating up on that process for one reason. 95% of the kids that go into IEPs, they don't graduate from those.
Right.
They end up in high school, going to college. They can't read. They can't write. I was in a technical high school with 225 kids, and I think they had between 3 and 8% proficiency, but 80% were on the honor roll. So, and I'm going to be very careful as I say this. I have tried in every school that I've been in to put together a reading program driven based on data, science, and mentorship. After 7.5 years, I was tired of banging up on the wall. No one wants to have the conversation. And there's a number of different reasons, and I'm not going to bash people but the process is so flawed and no one wants to have it. And you and I have talked about this. And regardless of your political views, when people yell at the press secretary and the press secretary goes, well, nobody said anything for the last 30 years. Now, again, regardless of your political views, the data is there. We're not equipping the teachers. We're not equipping our kids. So my whole master's thesis was through reading training and reading enrichment. One, we can help those kids that have dyslexia, which, by the way, side note, you're not even allowed to say the D word. Mm-hmm. That's considered a 504, which is another term for that's a medical problem. Mm-hmm. We don't have to really give an actual accommodation for that. We're not paying for that. I've had executives from certain school districts say, well, if this works, we're going to have to give it to everyone.
Which would be great.
Right.
Yeah.
And the irony is in the schools, these ratings, and then I want to get off the schools. I don't want to beat them up too bad. But like ratings, you basically have a couple of categories like economic, socio. Are they on food stamps or economics? Are they Title I? Blah, blah, blah. And if one student checks a bunch of these boxes, it pushes up their rating. And when you say, hey, you know, if you just let me work with 6 kids, I could bump your rating up, 30%.
Yeah.
And you take the credit. And here's why. P.S. Backtrack. I had to wait until I finished my master's program before I could decide what program of remediation. We're not allowed to say it's a cure. We're allowed to say it's a remediation. It's a retraining of the brain.
Right.
And I don't want to I know you've talked about this, so I won't take too much time on this, but I had to wait so that I didn't invalidate all of my research. Mm-hmm. It would have been unethical for me to say, well, this is the best one because it's based on science and data.
Right.
But all my other, it would have skewed the numbers.
Yeah.
So I had to fight through. So really the second person who deserves my master's degree is my wife, because I had to read every paper, every journal assignment out loud to her. Mm-hmm. And she would go, that don't make no sense.
Right.
So, with that in mind, I was like, hey, this is a no-brainer. This is Occam's razor is, I think it was a Jodie Foster movie where she talks about whatever the simplest answer is, is the best.
Probably the best. So what was the answer for you and your dyslexia?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
What was the answer for you and your dyslexia? What were you going to do about it?
So after looking at all the data, and I spent a year, I looked at over 24 programs. I mean, I looked at this scared straight. I looked at, I don't really want to mention the names because I don't want to
Sure.
be derogatory.
Yeah.
Even the dyslexia programs that have been around for 75 years,
Mhm.
nothing was over 30% proficiency,
Mhm.
30% success.
Right.
Like, what? And understand, school districts spend millions
Yeah.
millions of dollars on curriculum. And what they do is they just kind of put it all together. And our discussion has always been, it's based on science. What does that mean? What it means is if we were going to bake biscuits, I love when we talked about biscuits. There's basically 5 elements to the biscuits. There's eggs and flour and sugar and, water and whatever else you put in there. But if you don't have the recipe,
Mhm.
and they don't have the recipe. So they're just mixing and matching at school and hoping, boxcars, I hope it works.
Yeah.
And once in a while it does. And I said, I'm done with that. It was 2019 that we met in January.
Mhm.
I had until the end of November to submit my theses and my master's paper, which was, I think, 30 pages, 40 pages. Got an A student, summa cum laude at American Military University, even got an award that said lifetime exception. Unfortunately, the FedEx gal had to give me my certificate, my degree out front because of COVID.
Yeah.
And then I was able to go through remediation.
Mhm.
Now,
talk us through that. You're how old when you're going through dyslexia
50,
empowerment / dyslexia remediation?
I want to say 56, maybe 50. I'm 61 now. So I was over 55, 56.
Yeah.
A lifetime of carnage.
But why? Many people say, why would you want to do that? You already got a career. You're already successful. You got your master's degree. Why go through remediation? What's the point of that?
The whole point was to say, is it valid?
Okay.
That validity, 1, and 2, well, gosh, if I can fix this,
Mhm.
and you're not allowed to say fix it, I know,
Some people get really
I just want
that.
If I can improve,
empower that skill. If you can make another new strength, clearly you got strengths in those kinetic, concrete, sensory motor training skills for sniper shooting and training. How about if you also had strengths in reading? Why not have both?
And the challenge that I knew I had was editing, not comprehension. Comprehension means I have the idea, I can write, and I've written over, I don't know, 30 articles for magazines in subject matter area. I have subject matter expertise in being a police sniper and big bore or 50 caliber, blah, blah, blah. I said, if I could do that better, I could actually share my experience.
Gotcha.
Maybe someone else doesn't have to go through this. When I was on the phone with my mom saying, I just met this doc before she passed away. I just found out I'm just, we went through all the research. I said, I'm dyslexic. And they were like, oh, yeah, we knew you had a problem. I hung up on her.
Oh.
My sisters, both who have multiple master's degrees, they were like, oh, yeah, we knew you had a problem. When were you going to tell me? How can we diagnose it? That is one that has the issue.
Yeah. And so our one's asking, how do you get dyslexia diagnosed? Well, in some situations, for David, the diagnosis was experiential. He realized he's making these mistakes in reading, making these mistakes in spelling, and that was essentially the functional diagnosis. Now, for kids, you can get a formal diagnosis, and there's 3 criteria: poor reading accuracy, poor reading speed, poor reading comprehension. These are the only 3 criteria by which we diagnose dyslexia if the person's licensed to diagnose. And in the States, that's really important to make sure that you know who you're taking your child to. Are they actually licensed to diagnose dyslexia? Many people can do assessments and do an educational assessment, but if they're actually not licensed to diagnose, then your report's just going to say what you already knew, but you're not actually going to get the diagnosis. So it's important to know what you're looking at. And there's debate about whether or not diagnosis is really that essential, and whether or not, okay, but why not just put that money towards remediation, just empowering the skills? Because if you spend $3,000 or in some places $5,000 on a neuropsych, that money now is not going to be useful to actually do the actual treatment. And some people will be like, well, no, but they need to know all that data to know what treatment to do. To my knowledge to date, there's still no neuropsych that predicts what you should do treatment-wise, because we know the number one cause of dyslexia is that phonological processing. It affects your ability to sound out words. It's going to make that ability much, much harder. And so we have to look to what are the treatment programs that have been shown to be highly effective in changing those skills. And when we put those in place, then those are the ones going to give us the best chance to change the skills. Here's the big picture of dyslexia. It's genetic. That's the biology. Changes the wiring of the left side of the brain, makes that side of the brain less efficient in how it processes the phonological structures. That's the next circle, is that phonological piece. Down below that is next you learn sounds and you learn letters together. And then down below that is now you start the reading skills. These other dotted circles and dotted lines and things around it are other things that might co-occur, but they really aren't the dyslexia. So it's trying to figure out what can we do that's going to give us the best outcomes, give us the best chance to change the skills. And we're speaking to different parts of the world today too, David. So we have viewers in UK, Canada, Saudi Arabia.
What you just showed is, so one of the challenges we have with teaching law enforcement, for example, like going to an instructor school, and I've been to lots of them. I've got like 5,000 hours of vocational training. And they'd say, well, as an instructor, people learn either visually, they say, describe the beach, and either they give a visual or an audible or a kinetic, meaning feel. And that's not the way babies learn. That was the first thing that I figured out when I was doing my research. Babies don't learn that way. They're multi-sensory. And while I was doing training with someone who was a retired Navy SEAL, we did about 2 years of training for the Coast Guard. Mm-hmm. And these discussions, and that was one of the reasons that when you started telling me what they were doing, is I went, well, successful training comes from multi-sensory training, visual, audible,
right?
How it feels.
Yeah.
I used a mirror, to see.
Right.
Well, the brain works the way the brain works. You can't argue that science. And the recipe is the recipe. And the argument and the discussion is you're using a flawed, you keep getting stone hard biscuits for 30 years. Why don't you just look at the recipe?
Yeah, or find a better recipe. Find one that has a better outcome. Find one that's been tested. And back in the day, it was go get Betty Crocker's book. She tested it. She proved all the recipe works. But for education, there's still this myth that everybody's brain learns differently. That's completely false. As a neuropsychologist, I can tell you, there's no science that backs up that statement.
Correct.
They also are taught that, different people learn in different ways. That's also false. That's not an accurate statement. Everyone has the same 8 input systems. It's the 5 you learned in basic elementary school science class. See, hear, touch, taste, smell. But there's also 3 more. It's vestibular, proprioceptive, interoceptive. And that's on other podcasts I've talked about that. But know that those are the 8 by which everybody's brain works. If those 8 are not communicating efficiently, you're not building the stronger system. If the intervention helps get those 8 really communicating more efficiently, which is why you do research to figure out what most effectively does that, then we have a chance of drastically changing the literacy skills. And how did that feel for you as you started that remediation or that empowerment? Could you tell your skills were changing, and how? How did you know?
So within the first, I'm going to say 40 hours, I had a headache at the end of the hour. And I knew that it's the fundamentals that I needed was frequency and consistency. So it means I had to do it a bunch. And as I was learning those new skills, I'd have a headache. And I remember calling you and saying, Doc, why do I have a headache? Well, you're using neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is just basically a runway in your head that you
building a bigger pathway, building a bigger road for more traffic.
Yeah, it's building a high-speed travel way for your thoughts and your conscious and unconscious competencies. And I knew this as a law enforcement officer. Like it's hard to learn new skills. So I was like, I'm going to fight through this. Now, a lot of what I did want to mention was a lot of the programs are like, yeah, this is going to take 2, 3, 4, 6 years. I guess it could, but are you effectively doing what you set out to do? So in the first 40 hours or so, I began to see myself, and you probably noticed during the conversation, I overemphasize
Mhm.
words. I also use my hands. I
Mhm.
had to retrain myself to do that because I didn't realize that this helps you do this.
Right.
And the mispronunciation doesn't just come from here, it's here. So as that improved, I was working on a number of different skills, and I'm sure you've talked about them, but one of the skills was beginning to do spelling,
Mhm.
nonsensical words, just so I
Right.
could understand sounds.
Right.
The,
The
the
sound letter
phone,
connection is what we call phonics. It's phonetic spelling. Just
right.
sound it out. You feel a
And,
s, write an S. You feel a b, write a b. You feel a k, write a c or a k. You're learning the phonics of spelling.
and I had gotten past the part of the lips that your aunt and uncle had put together, where you recognize,
Mhm. Yep. The smile sounds, the open sounds, the tongue tappers, all those different
how
concrete
they
features.
feel, how they look, how they sound.
Yeah.
And now I was at the point where I was putting them together and learning to differentiate them, and then doing that, also working on spelling words. I think I sent you the photographs where you could see after a couple of weeks and then after months, my handwriting started to improve.
Hmm.
And we had discussed that, but was it just because, and my anecdotal thought about that is I used to scribble because it was just easier to write fast
Right.
than be able to misspell. As my reading skills improved and my recognition and my speed or fluency increased, my writing skills increased. And I think I got to like 96 hours, and I was like, I think I'm pretty much done. And I was reading books. I started reading in January of 2020. Now, the celebration is I'm on like 130. I've been reading novels as fast as I have time.
No, no, but in how long of a time period? In how many years have you read 130 novels?
Never.
5?
Yeah, literally in the last 5 years. Now, here's the point I wanted to make. After, like, I was almost done. I want to say in 2020, I was working in an elementary school, and I was working with they called it book club, where we were
Mhm.
reading books.
Yeah.
And the book, it was about the ape. I forget what his name was, the incredible something.
Mhm.
And they made a movie about it. But the kids, we'd read like two chapters, and then we'd come and talk about it. Well, I had gotten really busy at work, and I was running their sniper team in Flagler County, and I was like a little behind. And I looked up at my clock in my office. It was like 9 o'clock. I said, I have until 11. I started reading, and next thing I know, I was closing the book. I was like, ooh, I wasn't supposed to go that far. And I looked up, and it was like quarter to 11. I had to close my door because I called my wife. I started crying. I said, I just finished a book in one sitting.
Mm.
And I know exactly what it's about because I'm going to have to go answer questions with the kids.
Yeah. And how
So
old were you, David, when that happened? Just so the audience really understands.
57,
So at
58.
age 57, you read your first full book in one sitting.
Right. And not a big book, but
Yeah.
being able to fluently read through it. Now I'm reading like novels. Like, I've read through all of Mark Greene's work. I read through all of Tom Clancy's work. Mark Greene is the gray man. He was writing for Tom Clancy. I met him
Mhm.
I loved Tom Clancy, but it would take me months to read his books because they were so descriptive. I started reading Mark Greene's books, and then Jack Carr, and now Brad Thor. He's got like 20 something books. I think I'm up to almost 20, 22 books, 23 books of his. And, when I went on a cruise last year, I brought 2 books with me. I finished them in 2 days. If you leave me alone. And the one thing that I will tell you is, and I want to encourage people, is as you're going through your remediation, you don't become an Olympic star overnight. You
Right.
have to work on those skills. My reading fluency and comprehension has increased. 2, my ability to write and edit has become very refined. 3 years ago, I was hired back to Kaiser University online as a adjunct instructor. Well, it's all writing. And all I do is edit other people's work.
Yeah.
Who would have thought, I'm 61 now, but who would have thought that somebody that couldn't edit his own work is able to edit his students now and show them, hey, here's what you need to have in here. Here's how you transition this. That's all about comprehension and work. I know that stuff, but now I can see it.
Right.
So how much time do you want to take away from your success by not having a skill? Don't tell me you're a Superman or you got some super being power. You don't. There's no such. The Avengers is a comic book, and dyslexia is not an Avenger superpower. It's not a mutant power. It's a disability that can be overcome. I don't have to. It's not like I'm missing a limb and it mysteriously grows back, or that I can do something magical. It's the brain works the way the brain works. And if we're willing to say, yes, let's look for solutions, that was my whole point. What if we could mitigate, which is a fancy way of saying reduce, and find a way to redirect kids in elementary school to enrich their reading skills and improve their reading skills. And if they're and it doesn't matter if they have dyslexia or not, the formula, the recipe works.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't use the recipe, and that's part of the problem you and I have talked about, is people have said, oh, that's a great idea, I'll just use this and that. Well, you either go by the recipe. Your brain is very specific. If you build those skills properly, you build conscious competency. And I know this from teaching firearms and tactics, which is multitasking, which the brain can't do. Agreed? Like, the brain is not meant to do more than one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And people struggle with it. I mean, I just went through tactical training. We were just, in service, and it's like, I had a little bit too much going on. I overstuffed and, overexposed myself. But if we're able to help people refine their skills, we can enrich those kids. When they get out of third grade, they're reading, I want kids to be in that 200 book club.
Yeah.
Think about
how's that going to impact your knowledge of the prevalence of kids in juvenile justice, the number of people with illiteracy in the prison population? Make that clear distinction for us from your view in law enforcement, how illiteracy in elementary school relates to that school to prison pipeline.
So if I know that from pre-K to third grade, I need to be able to read, and instead of me knowing how to read, I read to you so you can pass the test, or some convoluted muddy water plan, and they're doing better. Like, I mean, they were talking about in one county on the West Coast where they were going to take percentages away. As long as it was 0 to 50%, somewhere in there, it was okay. How do we not? I can't help but think of that cartoon where they're on that spaceship and they're all just drinking Slurpees all day, and they don't know what they don't know. The idea is imagine if we could reduce that's how you reduce your prison population.
Right. Yeah. That's
how you improve your population. That's how you improve the economy. I don't need to know, there are generational places in this country and in every county across the country that economically and social groups, they're struggling.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what if we taught them a skill? And this is what I tell my students. Once you have your education, no one can take that away from you.
Right.
And if we
knowledge is power. That knowledge is
it absolutely. And if I can teach you to read a book without somebody putting their spin on it, now I can discuss it with you, as opposed to somebody going, this is what education is like today.
Right.
Oh, can I just read this myself?
Yeah.
And if we were willing to do that, I think, one, we would reduce crime in this country substantially. One. Two, we would improve our reading skills, which means what? If people can read, and you look at the countries in the world that have good reading skills, the end result are these productive individuals. They're making a great living, which people who can't read, over half of them end up homeless for at least, like 10 or 15% of their life. And I looked at that stat and I was like, huh? Now, not to get into mental health and all the other reasons, but if somebody is struggling to get a higher end job, or even to learn how to weld, you have to know how to read and write, to know how to do carpentry, and those are good paying jobs. I don't need to be a professor at a university. I mean, if I had to do it again, I might be an HVAC guy, and work on air conditionings,
Yeah.
But we're not teaching our kids to read, which results in what? And let me just finish up with this. Why are they using drug and alcohol? They're self-medicating.
Mm-hmm.
What is the highest mental health issue that we deal with in this country? Depression. Well, what are they doing? They're self-medicating. Violence. Why are they getting involved in violent acts? Well, I'm frustrated. If one more person tells me I'm lazy and I can't get a good job, so I got to do what I got to do. I got to eat. And then suicide. I suck. And
I feel less than. I feel less intelligent. I feel less smart. All the things that you felt like you were made to feel.
Stupid. I'm dealing with how do I get ahead? I don't fit in, blah, 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 all those things. And those three things I can attach directly to not being able to be involved. Because think about it, in school, what's going to happen? You're going to be a discipline issue. How do you know that, Deputy Agata? Well, I've been working in schools for 7.5 years, and one of the skills that we have to have in the state of Florida is to be able to do threat assessment and threat mitigation. And the first questions I ask is not whether the kid said, yeah, I'm going to kill everybody or do this, but what's the driver of that? Was he feeling bullied? Well, you can't say he's being bullied. It doesn't matter if he was or not. It's whether he feels he is. Well, if you say that, we'll have to investigate it. Okay. But then let's look at, tell me how, and I always say, tell me about their reading. Let me tell you something. I have made more administrators mad when I say, hey, and they get very upset. And I go, listen, I understand academia. I teach in the college. I understand it. Let me work with you. So, if we really want to make a change in our country, if we really want to reduce crime, it's not about releasing them from prison. It's about equipping them. It may not be about them stamping a license plate, but most of those skills, let's say they do learn skills, but if they can't fill out a job application, if they can't go to the bank and fill out a card, you at least need that. I know your phone, you can do all these, Venmo and apps, but if we're not going to equip people with the basic fundamental requirement of reading, then they're not going to know. They won't be able to move forward, and two, they won't be able to know, like all those books behind you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of information in there. Do you know that it is not a Gen Z thing to know their research? Mm-hmm. They don't know their history. They just, and I'm not opposed to technology, mm-hmm. but if you can't read and you can't say, that's wrong, that's right, those two things don't match, or where do they match?
Right.
And if we don't make a turn, if we don't efficiently make a turn, I don't want to hear one more, I've seen a lot of stuff. I'm sure you've seen more than me, Doc, but if I see one more cat say, if you just take clay and let people play with it, it'll help their brain work. Yeah. It doesn't work like that. I gotta be able to read this book.
Yeah.
Even if it's online.
So David, wrap us up with the thought of, now that you have literacy, looking back over your career, the choices you made, you chose law enforcement, or you felt law enforcement was the best option of what you had to choose from?
It was a limit on what I could and couldn't do.
Because
I didn't have the skills.
The reading skills.
I didn't have the academic skills.
Okay.
And, that was a requirement 35 years ago. Mm-hmm. And even after I got into law enforcement, I didn't have the academic skills to promote. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure I could be a chief or a sheriff somewhere if I really wanted to.
Yeah.
Now that I have the academic, but I'm 61. Do they want a guy my age? Right. But by not knowing and not having the skills to move forward, I had to go with what I had to go with. And I'm telling you, Doc, I still talk to cops today who say, I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I struggle with my reports. And I'm like, okay, well, here's some things that you can do. Here's the direction you can go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of them go,
I'll work around it.
yes.
Yeah.
And that whole mentality of let's just work around it. Why?
Yeah. Or let's expect the employer to make changes so you don't have to read. And that's impossible to do. There's no way the employer can make accommodations for every variation in lack of skills. More empowering for the person is give as many people as possible as many functional skills in reading, in spelling, in comprehension, in writing, in math, so they have the opportunity to choose their own course, to choose their own promotion they're going to work towards, just
Yes.
getting all those things working in their favor. And they're now in charge of it. They control the path that they choose. And David, we've run out of
they're
time.
likely to do better.
Yeah,
if they have more choices and you give them the capabilities,
yeah,
you're going to have greater successes. And nobody in education wants to have that discussion right now.
Well, it's hard to figure out where do you point the blame to the start of it, and it's multifaceted.
Yes,
and it's not teachers' fault. Teachers are the ones who are doing all the hard work. But if you don't give the teachers the effective tools that have been proven, and you tell them to keep guessing, you're not helping them be highly successful. Guessing and randomly trying it and telling the teacher you need to read a little bit more so you know a little bit more so you can guess better is not the most effective way to do things. And it's not what we do in healthcare. We don't let physicians guess from chem labs what might be an antibiotic. Nobody wants that to happen. That was going to cause medical malpractice by harming people. You want them using the chemicals that have already been tested and proven to be, this is penicillin, this is amoxicillin, this is, C-chlor, this is Nurtec, whatever medications that have already been.
And that exact example, Doc, is it neglect or malpractice? Because the difference between neglect and malpractice is I made a mistake. Malpractice is it's just easier.
Right.
And I'm not going to make that accusation, but I think that's the rhetorical question for the way we are teaching. And the fact that the last 7.5 years, I have attempted in every school I've been, and maybe it's me, I can take responsibility. I'm unapproachable sometimes. But just ask my wife, she'll tell you. But to say, hey, give me a half dozen kids. Let's just try. If I'm wrong, but if I'm right, you take the credit. I'm good.
And see what happens to their self-esteem when their literacy goes up. What happens to their self-esteem when their competence goes up? When, like you said, you now knew I'm intelligent. I wasn't lazy. I didn't think I was lazy. Those people were calling me lazy, but I'm actually intelligent. I just had difficulty learning how to read because you can't be held accountable for a skill that nobody has actually helped you build yet.
Right.
And it's not that your brain is wired differently. It's wired less efficiently, as it is with any new skill. Any new skill you have, the brain does not have efficient wiring. When you get the proper instruction with the proper intensity, the proper frequency, the proper specificity, the proper developmental hierarchy, and the proper amount of duration of the practice, and that works to a way that we now have built that really efficient skill, you now can be held accountable because we gave you the skill, helped you build it, and you've got it. Now, what are you going to do with it?
And that's the exact discussion we had, and I was going to have in law enforcement training. And I went, you know what? I don't think it'll have as great an impact on changing our country as teaching people to read based on that learning process.
Right.
And, I'm still working on where do we find our way to do that? But that's really the issue. And if you're someone that's just saying, how do I fix this? How do I help? You got to start with yourself, and you have to decide, do I want changes? And if so, what are the most effective methods for me to do that? And that's what I did. And the outcome was, this ain't gonna, nothing that's good is easy, but once you get past it, it makes your life easier when it comes to where you want to go and how you want to get there. It's momentum. And, I just feel like there's so many folks that every time I tell them my story, they're like, I think I have that. I'm like, well, if you need some help.
That's it. And so I'm putting some links in the post right now. I put a link into the Morris Center's website. You can sign up and get a free consultation there. I put a link into the Now Programs and More Center's YouTube channel. There's tons of information there that is scientific information. We want families, adults, men and women re-entering into society out of the incarcerated systems to have the most accurate information, to make the best choices, to get the best chance for the best outcomes. And David, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your busy day and sharing us your dyslexia success story, because you're now an adult who's a young man of 61, who with 5 years, you've read about 130 novels because you can and you wanted to.
Yes. Yeah. That doesn't include all the research that I've done.
That's right. That's right. Or the newspapers or anything else your wife needs you to read too. All those pieces together. But thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks for the comments.
Thanks for listening.
We'll look forward to having another Dyslexia Success Story in 2 weeks. Take care, David. Thanks again.